Well, if you're like me, you hear that first reading and you think, who in the world is this Shebna dude? Right? Who in the world is this guy? A couple of things that you may know already. You probably are aware that every Sunday in ordinary time, week to week, the gospel and the first reading are meant to correlate well with one another. So the Old Testament reading is meant to help us see something more clearly in the gospel. And oftentimes I focus my preaching on the gospel because I try to keep my homily to 10 minutes. You're welcome. This weekend, however, I do need to talk about that first reading before I can talk about the gospel, so I confess it's a longer homily than normal, but I hope you appreciate it. So what's going on in this first reading? What's happening here? Well, we've got a couple of things. First, we hear about this. There's the king of David. We don't really need to know his name, but we do know there's a king of Israel, and he's from the line of David, so he's got the royal authority. And then we have this Shebna guy who shows up, and Shebna we hear that he has this title. His title is Master of the Palace. And the master of the palace was given the keys to the palace. He was also the one who was seen as second in command. He was second in authority to only the king. And so the master of the palace has the authority to open and close the door, which means he's the one who allows people to either see the king or not see the king. The problem with Shebna is he has a fatal flaw. And the fatal flaw is this: Shebna forgets who the king is. And he doesn't necessarily forget the person. He begins to think that in this distorted reality that he's the king. And so he starts to act with royal authority that's not his. And so he's abusing his power. And so, because he's abusing his power, because he's forgotten the real king, that it's not him, that there's actually a king, because of these things, you have the prophet Isaiah. He shows up. And he's speaking God's word to Shebna, and Isaiah says very challenging things to him, and he says, hey, listen, dude, you're doing all the wrong things. You think you're the one who's in control. You think you're the one who has the authority. You don't. And because you've been acting and abusing your power, the Lord's going to strip you away from your office of master of the palace. And you're no longer going to have this role. And instead, we're going to give this place of authority, we're going to give the person the keys to a different person, and his name is Eliakim. So here we have Eliakim. He enters the picture, and Eliakim, who's apparently this nobody, comes in and he receives the greatest job he could get. He's now second in command in the kingdom. It's all important for us to understand this gospel, because every key player in the Old Testament has an analogous one in our gospel this morning. So first, who's the king? Who's the king? Well, Jesus kind of flippantly asked his disciples, who do people say that I am, right? And then eventually he asked them, who do they say that he is? And you have this wonderful confession from Peter: you are the Christ. You are the Son of Man. You are the Son of the living God. I imagine Jesus looking at his disciples and especially Peter and kind of like, dude, you is not wrong. You is not wrong. But here's the thing. When it comes to who Jesus is, he doesn't sugarcoat it. He doesn't say, no, you don't understand. He says, yeah, I am the Lord. I am him. I am who am. So he is the Lord. He is the King. Who is the Christ? The Christ is the Messiah. The Messiah is the one who is to come to initiate God's kingdom. And if there's a kingdom, there has to be a king, and that king is Jesus. So we know very clearly the king is Jesus. Who's Shebna? That's the next question. Who is Shebna in our gospel? This one's a little bit more subtle. But Shebna, when Jesus asked the question, who do people say that I am? Again, I just laugh as I picture this scene, because it's not as if I think Peter's the only one that knows that Jesus is the Lord. I think he's the only one who has the courage to say it. But I just imagine the disciples like, yeah, Jesus, they all think you're like Elijah or like a prophet, but we know. They don't understand who you are, Who's Shebna? It's the people that can't recognize Jesus. Shebna is the person who always, who is unable to see who the real king is. That's Shebna. Shebna is also the person who abuses authority. So it's not just those who don't recognize the king, it's all those who use their authority and lord it over others. And in this case, it's no longer Shebna, it's the scribes and the Pharisees. They're Shebna, because they've used their authority to lord it over God's people. They've no longer become stewards of God's people. They've used it to have power and control. So Shebna is also the religious authorities of the day who have abused their power and authority. Then, of course, the easiest corollary here, the easiest one to identify is who's Eliakim in our gospel. And that's Peter. Enter Peter. You are the Christ. You are the Son of the living God. Peter's the only one who has the courage to say, you are him. I don't know why I'm thinking of this. People say, I am him or I am her. It's like Jesus is the first, I am him, He is the one. You are the Christ. That's what Peter says to Jesus. And of course, what is Peter given? He is now given, he's this fisherman, this nobody is now being given the keys to the kingdom. He is now the new steward. He's the new master of the palace. He is the one who is second in command. This is Peter. So who is that? That's the Pope. This is all about the papacy, my friends. This is all about the papacy. Sometimes I think we forget. We almost like discredit Jesus, I think. We forget that he knows what he's doing. And here's what I mean. Jesus knows at some point he's going to ascend. He's going to leave this world. He's going to be with the Father in heaven. And he needs to give us a structure. He needs to give us a leader. And to think that he wouldn't give us a leader of the church, to think that he wouldn't give us a pope, to think that he would leave us fatherless, that's crazy. That's ridiculous. Jesus knew that this church that he was founding, that as he initiated the kingdom of heaven through the church, it needed a leader, it needed a pope, it needed Peter. The question then becomes, how is this relevant in our lives today? What does this mean for you and me? And the first question really for all of us to ask is this. The same question that Jesus asked the disciples. Who do you say that I am? Who do you say? Because the answer to that question is going to decide everything else in all of our lives. Is Jesus the Lord or is he not? Everything follows from that. I'll appeal to C.S. Lewis here. I've done this before, but C.S. Lewis, he gives 3 responses to that question. Who is Jesus, right? And he says 2 responses are reasonable. They're logical. You could believe either one. And then he says there's a 3rd response, and forgive me, I'm not calling anybody this. He says the 3rd response is stupid. He's very blunt. You can't believe the 3rd response because it makes 0 sense. So here's the 2 responses that he says you could believe. He says the first one is, you could say, in answer to the question, who is Jesus? Who do you say that I am? Is, you're crazy. That's the first one. And the reason why, you look surprised. The reason why is because I don't know about you, but if I came to you and I said, hey, by the way, I'm the Lord, you'd be like, dude, you are a little disconnected from reality, man. You are not God's gift to the world, right? And you'd be right. I am not. I'm a sinner. I am not the Lord. I'm just like you, right? We are all in the same boat. But Jesus very clearly says he's the Lord. So he's either crazy or he's being honest about who he is. So that's why C.S. Lewis says you could say he's crazy. Second option, the correct option, is that he is who he says he is. That he is the Lord. He is the Son of the living God. He is I am who am. And Jesus says to us in the Gospels, he says especially in St. John, the Gospel of St. John, if you don't believe me and my words, believe the works. Believe all the signs and miracles and wonders that you've seen. Because the signs point to the reality that I am who am. That I am the Lord. See, if Jesus just said he was the Lord and didn't back it up, we'd be like, okay, but he backed it up. He definitely backed it up. He is who he says he is. So really the only answer is he's the Lord. And the 3rd response that, again, C.S. Lewis says is stupid is you cannot believe that Jesus is just this wonderful guy, this moral teacher, and not the Lord. That makes 0 sense. It is quite frankly, intellectually irresponsible. And unfortunately, I have to say, in today's world, if you want me to, one of the most common heresies in our country, it's that. Jesus is just a good guy. He just, great moral teacher, not the Lord though. Well, that's convenient. Because if he's just a great guy, that means you don't have to follow. He's not your authority in life. But if he's the Lord, that means everything has to follow what he says. People don't like that. He's the authority. He is the king. He is the one. There's a reason why we have Christ the King Sunday, the end of ordinary time, because that's who Jesus is. So we have to first answer the question, is Jesus our king? Is he the authority of my life? Is he the one who decides? Because we have these questions, right? We have these things in our life where it's like, I need to decide what I believe about this. And we oftentimes first ask ourselves. But if we start with ourselves, we're starting in the wrong place. We need to first go to Jesus. What does Jesus say? And if Jesus says this, then that's the answer. That's what I must believe. That's how I must act. So Jesus has to be our primary authority in our lives. The second question then, which I think is the most challenging one for us, because now we make human beings involved. And whenever we get involved, we mess it up, you know? But now we bring in human beings. We have the Pope. We have the church. And Jesus shares his authority. I use that word shares intentionally. He shares his authority with the Pope, with our leadership, with the bishops, to preserve and sustain our church over time. We have the Eucharist today because of that. We have the Eucharist because the church was given a structure and leadership. As an example to this, I have a buddy, I think I've shared this before, but it's really relevant for this homily, but a good friend of mine I grew up with, very close friends, Protestant, loves the Lord, have no fear of his salvation. But I ached for him to be Catholic. And he asked me one day, he says, Stephen, my question for you about your faith is, when did the Catholic Church start believing in the Eucharist, the real presence? And I said, dude, wrong question. And he just looked at me bewildered. I said, wrong question. You assume that we just one day decided the Eucharist was the real presence of Jesus Christ. No, my friend. It's from the beginning, from Jesus himself, John 6. Jesus is the one who gave us the Eucharist. And not only that, we have 256 popes where the church has consistently and preserved this teaching over 2,000 years. It's not made up. It's the gift of Jesus to his church. So the question I asked him and said that he needs to ask himself is, why did people stop believing in the real presence? Why did people stop? Similar to this, in our world today, as a priest, I hear this often, Father, I'm no longer Catholic because of this issue. And I have to tell you, rarely is that issue because of the Immaculate Conception. It's almost never that reason. Once you're Catholic, you can accept that. You're like, oh, that's awesome. Yeah, praise Jesus. Mary's awesome. Okay. The reason I hear is something like this. Father, I'm no longer Catholic because I just can't get over how pro-life the church is. Or I'm just not with the church on the gender issues of the day. Or I'm frustrated with the church's teaching on sexuality and marriage, divorce, annulments. Or I just don't get it anymore. It's this issue. But here's the problem. When we leave the church because of one thing that we don't like, we've become Shebna. Let me say that again. When we leave the church because of one issue that we don't agree with or we struggle with, we've become Shebna. We've lost reality, we've lost sight of who the real king is, and we've made ourselves the authority. Church of one. I believe in what I believe. Well, that's convenient, but it's pretty isolating. We're not part of a church of one. We're part of a church of communion of persons and saints, and God is the king and the authority. So the question for all of us this weekend is simply this. Are we willing to not be Shebna and to make Jesus the true authority of our lives?